Hello everyone! If you're watching this video, then you know what it's time for! Another Jane Eyre adaptation comparison. Last time I talked about the first part of Jane's childhood, her time at Gateshead living with her relatives, the Reeds, up to the point when her aunt sends her away to school. In this video, I'm going to continue with the second part of Jane's childhood, her experiences at Lowood Institution, the charity school for girls. This part of the story, which I refer to as the Lowood section, spans chapters 5 through 11 of Charlotte Bronte's novel. That's pages 42 to 96 in my smelly old paperback edition. That's a lot of content, so I hope you'll forgive me if I don't go through everything in excruciating detail. We would be here all day, and the video is going to be long enough as it is. First, I'll do a summary of the highlights. Highlights? That doesn't really feel like the right word. It's a little too positive. Here are some of the most important elements of the Lowood section. Conditions at Lowood are horrible. The food is meager and often inedible, and the building is so cold that the water is often frozen. Discipline is strict, and Mr. Brocklehurst's rule of self-denial as the best means of instruction is closely adhered to. Jane finds a friend in Helen Burns, a slightly older girl with a calm, composed temperament. She's both knowledgeable and spiritual, a positive influence who gently rebukes Jane when Jane gets angry about the injustices at the school. Helen herself is repeatedly punished by one teacher, Miss Scatcherd, for her so-called slatternly ways. But Helen doesn't think this is unfair. She admits she has faults that need correction, and as she views her time on Earth as only temporary, it's not too hard for her to bear it. This is completely contrary to Jane's perspective up to this point. The other positive influence on Jane at Lowood is Miss Temple, the superintendent who treats the girls with as much kindness and fairness as she's able to get away with. This is especially evident after the mortification of Brocklehurst's visit, which occurs after Jane's been at Lowood for 3 weeks. Brocklehurst harangues Miss Temple about what he sees as unnecessary expenditures, and then is distracted by the appalling sight of a girl with curly hair, because according to him, her hair shouldn't be allowed to behave naturally. He orders that the hair of all the older students be cut. At this unfortunate moment, Jane drops her slate and draws his attention to her. He humiliates her by putting her on a stool and announcing to the whole school that she's a liar who the other girls must avoid. This punishment could have completely broken Jane, were it not for the reassurances of Helen and Miss Temple. Miss Temple comes in after Helen's been comforting Jane, and invites the two girls to have a little party with her in her apartment, and she hears Jane's side of the story. She checks the story with Dr. Lloyd, and publicly clears Jane's name. After this, Jane settles into life at the school and improves. Things go well until springtime, when 2 tragedies strike. First, there's an outbreak of typhus that kills a number of students. Second, Helen, who's been coughing this whole time, finally succumbs to consumption. Jane visits Helen in Miss Temple's room, unaware how close she is to death. Helen is sweetly considerate of Jane, even in her last hours, and her faith in God and heaven is unshakable. She dies in Jane's arms. Soon after that, the book jumps forward. Jane spends 2 years as a teacher, then Miss Temple gets married and leaves. After 8 years at Lowood, Jane is restless to leave and advertises for a position as a governess. Just before she leaves for Thornfield, she receives a visit from Bessie, her old nursemaid, who updates her on the Reeds and tells her that an uncle came to see her at Gateshead before he left for Madeira and was disappointed not to find her. I admit I tend to forget about this visit, but this information will be somewhat important later on. Those are what I consider to be the main points of the Lowood section, although my personal notes for doing this comparison were a little more extensive. Alright, let's dig into the adaptations. In the 1934 version, Jane is met at the door by Miss Temple. She gets fitted, sort of, for her school uniform, and her ringlets are chopped off. She's then taken to Brocklehurst, who tells Miss Temple that Jane is deceitful. Brocklehurst interrogates Jane, the dialogue that normally would have occurred at Mrs. Reed's house, and I hate to say it, but I don't find Jane very likable here. Fast forward 8 years, Jane is teaching, and Brocklehurst interferes as she's about to discipline a child. She argues with his methods, and he fires her. With nothing to lose, I guess, except a reference, Jane takes the opportunity to criticize his management of the school to his face. She calls him a child beater and an ugly old crocodile, which is funny, but kind of juvenile. Jane's pretty pleased about all this when she delivers the news to Miss Temple. She's tickled pink that she finally got to tell Brocklehurst off, and she's not too worried about the future because,
with the small inheritance my uncle left me, I shall manage until I find something.
That is not correct. Basically, this version only kept two things from this part of the book, Miss Temple being the head of the school and something of a friend to Jane, and Jane herself becoming a teacher. Miss Temple is often left out of things, so I guess that's good. In the 1944 version, or 43, however you prefer to think of it, Jane is sound asleep when she arrives at Lowood. She wakes up the next day to find that it's not at all the kind of place she was expecting. And it only gets worse because Brocklehurst makes his speech branding her a liar on her very first day, something later adaptations would also do, probably for greater dramatic effect. Helen Burns is played by young Elizabeth Taylor, definitely the most famous person to play the character to date. Hers is one of the most angelic or saintly Helens. Jane confides in Helen how desperately she wants to be loved, that she would even do herself bodily harm if it meant someone would love her. It's a sad speech and a drastic sentiment coming from such a young girl. Contrast that with how she feels years later, when she still aches for love and affection, but she also has a high moral standard that she's compelled to obey. They put Miss Scatcherd in charge of the school here. She's played by Eileen Malian, a character actress I've seen in umpteen movies, though I never remember her name. There are several added scenes in this section. In one, an older girl takes food off Jane's plate while they're praying over dinner. That makes me really mad. In another, Helen hangs clothes to dry while Jane wistfully expresses a desire to escape and see the world. The Mr. Lloyd St. John Rivers composite character, Dr. Rivers, comes back into the picture at this point. He and Jane are friends and have a nice rapport, which is unusual, as Rochester is generally the first man in her life with whom she's able to connect. Helen is the one whose curly hair Brocklehurst gets upset about. It's the first time an adaptation makes that change, but not the last. As he's cutting it off, Jane protests, begging him to stop or to cut her hair instead, so he punishes them both by sending them out to walk in the rain, leading Helen's poor health to take a downward turn. Dr. Rivers and Mr. Brocklehurst oppose each other on everything at the school. Rivers warns about Helen's cough, and Brocklehurst ignores it, and when Helen is dying, Rivers criticizes Brocklehurst's hypocritical prayer and basically accuses Brocklehurst of killing her. After Helen's death, which is a sweet and touching scene, an inconsolable Jane cries over her grave. Dr. Rivers gently chastises her, telling her that she needs to be brave and strong and to focus on doing her duty, even if she doesn't want to do it. Slightly echoing the actual St. John Rivers here, he says she must prepare herself to do God's work in the world, therefore she must get an education. Jane accepts this sullenly, but it does give her the incentive to keep going. Fast forward 8 years, instead of Jane being a teacher already, Brocklehurst is holding a meeting to discuss hiring her. They mainly want her because they'd be able to pay her much less than an outsider, 20 guineas a year minus 10 for expenses. That makes her Thornfield salary sound like a fortune. But in a private conversation with Brocklehurst, she coldly turns down the offer. She's stiff, almost monotone in Brocklehurst's presence, a big change from the outspoken, passionate child. Brocklehurst makes a final offer with the extra threat that if she leaves, she can never come back. Those who have seen this movie may remember that this does come up again. Ugh. Dr. Rivers sees her off with some final words of encouragement and foreshadowing.
Jane, it's not every young woman that can face the world single-handed. But you know what right is. You'll stick to it through thick and thin.
The 1970 version pleasantly surprises me. They did not include the Gateshead section, which I don't like. But they do spend a considerable amount of time at Lowood and go out of their way to include some interesting details. The adaptation begins with Jane's walk down the long path to the school, a foreboding start. This version does a good job emphasizing the cold. The girls shiver in flimsy underclothes while they smash the ice in the pitchers. Jane meets Helen unofficially at the wash basins, where Helen is punished severely for not scrubbing her neck. This Miss Scatcherd really has it out for Helen. She doesn't just pick on her, she seems to dislike her intensely and says horrible things to her. Jane's first day coincides with our introduction to this version's Brocklehurst, played by Jack Hawkins. At first, he doesn't seem so bad. Jane does fall for his trap, though. He asks if there is any hungry child in the school, and poor Jane is the only one who doesn't know better than to raise her hand. When she steps forward, he recognizes her, and that's when he makes his speech. This is the only version that specifically shows how awful Sundays are for the students, with the long, windy walk to the church and back, and the girls racing to crowd around the meager fire on their return. And this turns into an opportunity to show more of Miss Scatcherd's cruelty. Helen wasn't doing anything wrong here. It's like Miss Scatcherd merely heard her voice and hated it so much that she wanted to punish her. Jane is angered by this injustice and gives Miss Scatcherd a death glare. Helen is not directly a spiritual mentor, but she does represent a spirit of kindness, gentleness, meekness, and since there's hardly any relief from Miss Temple here, I'm not sure how much she's even in charge at this school, Helen really is the only decent person at Lowood. Brocklehurst comes again, this time with his wife and daughters, to inspect the classes. He's pleased at first, until he gets to the wavy-haired girl, who in this version is Jane herself. Now Brocklehurst turns vicious, and it's not just that her hair is being cut, the whole incident feels abusive. He makes Jane stand on a stool again and then leaves. Helen helps her, which of course prompts Miss Scatcherd to punish Helen. She makes her stand on a stool outside, where it starts to rain, thereby hastening Helen's death. This Miss Scatcherd is the worst. I like this young Jane, played by Sarah Gibson. She might be a bit older than 10, I don't know, but she has a look that I think fits the character. Jane is supposed to be a plain child, probably thin and angular, a bit haunted-looking perhaps, but she also has this expression, as a child and as an adult, that several characters comment on. It's a very direct look, one that Mrs. Reed and Bessie find unnerving. It's like it's too mature or too perceptive for a child. In the moment when it starts to rain on Helen outside, the camera gradually pushes in on Jane's face. Her expression is still, yet somehow she conveys her inner outrage. In Helen's last scene, she tells Jane they're sending her home to her guardian, but promises she'll be back when warm weather comes and heather blooms on the moors. Because of the way the actress plays it, I think Helen knows that she's dying, but also knows that Jane hasn't grasped that fact yet. So rather than upset her, she says things to comfort her instead. Fast forward 8 years, Jane is visiting Helen's grave. Brocklehurst comes up to ask her to stay on at Lowood as a teacher rather than take the governess position at Thornfield, and Jane basically says, "I'd rather die." The 1973 adaptation ticks a lot of boxes, though it might not be as artistically stimulating as other versions. Lowood Institution is a stark place, decorated with portions of Bible verses on the walls, sometimes misquoted or lifted out of context. Note that the school plaque reads only the first part of Matthew 5:16, leaving out the end of the verse, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." In the book, the verse isn't truncated like that. The girls are sent outside for exercise in pathetically flimsy cloaks, and it's obvious how limited the clothing allowance is. Since the dresses are so short and tight on the older students, each girl must be fitted for one dress and not allowed a new one for years. Helen Burns is definitely older than Jane here, and definitely one of the most sickly-looking Helens from the start. She kindly takes Jane under her wing. She doesn't mind her interrupting her reading and willingly answers her questions, except the one about whether or not she's happy at Lowood. But Jane's persistent, and that's when Helen gives her wise counsel about endurance and patience, doing your duty, and returning good for evil. Helen is punished by Miss Scatcherd, who seems like a cranky old lady who likes to be miserable. She's the only one not thrilled about Miss Temple's donation of bread and cheese, but to give her credit, she is the first one to step forward and congratulate Jane when her name is cleared, and she shows compassion for the girls during the typhus outbreak. So she's cranky, but she's capable of sincere kindness, not the antagonist she is in other versions. This Jane constantly seems a little lost, a little not with it. It's a funny change from the last two young Janes, who were more prone to anger than to tears and depression. I find it easy to feel sorry for this Jane, she's very pathetic, but I wish she were a little bit sharper. Brocklehurst here is not excessively nasty, he's not raving or snarling, yet he's just as much a hypocrite, freaking out over naturally curly hair while his daughters with their probably artificially curled hair sit just behind him. Note that Brocklehurst gives the order to cut the hair, but it doesn't actually happen, at least not on screen. This version and 1983 both handle it this way, as it is in the book. It's only the movies that have a traumatic hair-cutting scene. Miss Temple is a pleasant woman who holds her own against Brocklehurst when he questions her on every single extra expense, and she and Helen have their discussion of literature, one of several moments here that I suspect the casual viewer might find a little dull, but it is in the book. This is the first version to include the typhus outbreak, abruptly introduced by a girl collapsing on the floor while adult Jane's voiceover talks about something completely different. It's satisfying to see the board members turn their backs on Brocklehurst for once after witnessing the horrible conditions the students are forced to live in. After Helen's death of consumption, which she does her best to prepare Jane for gently and matter-of-factly, we fast-forward 8 years. Jane is a teacher, desperate for escape, or at least for a new servitude, and in the very next scene, she's arriving at Thornfield. 1973 and 1983, as always, are neck and neck. Which one you think is most faithful to the book in the Lowood section, I think depends on personal preference and on what you think are the most important elements to include. In the 1983 version, Jane is dropped off at the door. From outside, she can hear a school-wide recitation. Note the plaque in this version has the full verse. Jane is brusquely called inside, but then she's met by Miss Temple and Miss Miller, so the first impression isn't totally awful. It's certainly not the nightmarish descent it is in a few other versions, thanks to Miss Temple's kind manner and solicitous questions. The way the school is run is almost militaristic, especially when Miss Scatcherd is given leave to rule with an iron fist, when Miss Temple isn't present to intervene with grace and mercy. Interestingly, there's evidence of some friction between Miss Temple and Miss Scatcherd, especially when Miss Temple clears Jane's name. In spite of all the discipline, however, the girls are quite lively. Whenever they're left on their own, they erupt with energy and noise, and no one rushes in to silence or punish them. Jane has some trouble adjusting to all this, both the strict rules and the brief moments of riotous freedom. Both are so alien to her, and she's lonely, which is why she approaches Helen, the only other girl in the yard who is alone. This Helen looks and behaves the most like the Helen I envision from the book. She politely answers Jane's question but wants to go on reading, but gradually she becomes more responsive as she sees that Jane needs a friend. There's so much I prefer about this version. I really like this Miss Temple and this Helen. Miss Scatcherd is menacing and cold, but not over the top, and young Jane continues to impress me as she did at Gateshead. And it includes a lot of lesser details. It makes a big deal about the burnt porridge, maybe too big a deal, and they have the bit where Miss Temple provides her own cake for Jane and Helen after the cook refuses to make more because of Brocklehurst's budget. The attention to detail is so great that it's downright shocking when they leave out what many consider to be the central event of the section, the scene at Helen's deathbed. Typhus fever breaks out, many girls die, many are sent home. Jane has nowhere to go, so she stays and lingers in the hall to hear how Helen's doing. The doctor clarifies that Helen has consumption, not typhus, but lets Jane know that she won't live much longer. and then we cut to a shot of Helen's gravestone. What? This is such a glaring and weird omission that I feel there must be a legitimate reason why they skipped over it. Like, did the actress playing Helen suddenly have to leave and they didn't want to recast her part and refilm those scenes? I don't know. I want there to be a good explanation. Still, at approximately 33 minutes, this is the most extensive adaptation of the Lowood section, even including more of the in-between period before Jane gets the Thornfield job. We see her teaching, waving goodbye to the newlywed Miss Temple, anxiously awaiting a reply to her advertisement and rushing to the post office, and interacting with the new superintendent. And this is the only version that includes Bessie's visit, which makes me happy. It helps the plot development later on feel less random, plus it's just a pleasure to see this Bessie again. With the 1996 adaptation, things go back to being a little more cinematic. Everything's done just a little bit differently. This version boasts well-known actors among the staff at Lowood: Geraldine Chaplin as Miss Scatcherd, she runs the school, and Amanda Root as Miss Temple, which is excellent casting. You know the second you look at her that she's a sympathetic soul. Jane arrives at Lowood with Brocklehurst, who wastes no time announcing to the school that she is a liar, and thus the girls should be on their guard against her. He makes Jane stand there long enough that she starts falling asleep on the stool. He finally relents and allows her to join the girls in singing. It's Helen who helps her down and shares her hymnal. Later in bed she gives her some bread and cheese, and the next morning she helps her get dressed. She doesn't seem much bigger than Jane, but acts like an older sister. Unfortunately, she's so busy helping the younger girls that she neglects her own cleanliness, so Miss Scatcherd goes after her at inspection. But as strict as things are at this Lowood, there are lax moments. Girls are allowed to play and amuse themselves, while others have music lessons. Once again, it's Helen's hair that offends Brocklehurst. The whole scene plays out very differently in this version. Jane's inspired to sketch Helen and asks her to remove her bonnet, and out comes this beautiful mass of curly red hair. The aesthetic moment is ruined when Brocklehurst sees them and freaks out about the hair. Jane and Miss Temple both try to intervene, but Brocklehurst insists on cutting her hair to mortify her vanity. Jane protests, making it a battle of wills between her and Brocklehurst. Brocklehurst wins the battle, but Jane wins the war as she joins Helen in solidarity and lets her own hair get lopped off, to everyone's alarm, including Miss Scatcherd. Whenever something awful happens, Miss Temple is there right after to soothe and encourage and give as much affection as she can get away with. She comes that night to give the girls a pep talk about using the intelligence they've been gifted with to gain their freedom and exert their independent wills. Shortly after, Jane wakes to find Helen's mattress rolled up and follows the sound of coughing to locate her. They did a good job with Helen's coughing and makeup here. In spite of her obvious discomfort, she talks calmly of their meeting again in heaven. Jane expresses doubt, and Helen says fervently, "You must believe." This version is never one of my favorites, and I don't think the Lowood section is perfect, but this is one of the most emotional Helen death scenes. It all comes together so well. We fast forward 8 years. Jane takes leave of Helen's grave before heading to Thornfield, and we have another emotional parting as she says goodbye to her constant friend, Miss Temple, who stays behind at the school to continue doing her duty in taking care of the unwanted girls. The 1997 version starts the section more optimistically than most. For once, Jane is greeted by a warm, friendly face, Miss Temple's, so she's excited the next morning when a girl tells her to hurry and get dressed in time for breakfast. We learn through adult Jane's voiceover, though, that everything at Lowood is terrible. Actually, it kind of disappoints me that we only hear about the burnt porridge, the ice water, etc., rather than seeing it. What we see are images of girls playing hopscotch in a snowy courtyard and Jane making a friend. The visual is a little bit at odds with the misery being described. Helen acknowledges to Jane that life is cruel sometimes, but we have to accept it or we'll be, quote, forever in torment. Jane just looks at her like, "What are you talking about?" We get a brief glimpse of a witch-like Miss Scatcherd, who snarls at Helen for not knowing where the West Indies are, or maybe it's because she doesn't point it out properly. It's unclear. Brocklehurst arrives with his wife and daughters. Jane's slate falls as she stands, causing him to lash out at her because slates cost money, girl! He's extremely shouty, even with his family standing right there. I would think he'd maybe curb it back a little bit, but nope. The adaptation does a fair job. Not great, but not bad. This version alone has typhus come with the spring, not in the middle of winter. I know it's insignificant, but it always strikes me in the book how the girls are having so much fun frolicking outside, and then within days they're dead and dying. I confess I don't find this deathbed scene as compelling as others, maybe because I find the girls acting on the distracting side. Miss Temple carries Jane away, and then we fast forward 8 years. Jane's a popular teacher, letting her students look through her sketches before she leaves for Thornfield. Whew, we're almost done. In the 2006 version, we go back to the nightmarish Lowood, made even more eerie by the odd, kind of fisheye filming style. Jane arrives late at night at a castle like Lowood. There seems to be plenty of square footage, and yet she's led down to extremely dank and crowded sleeping quarters. She's put directly to bed, but makes eye contact and exchanges smiles with Helen in the next bed over. The next morning, Jane is a little slow to catch on to the regimented order dictated by the ringing of the bells. I would describe her first day as one dominated by culture shock. And yet again, Brocklehurst's arrival, with wife and daughters, makes her day even worse. In such a sea of identical-looking girls, she might have disappeared if only she hadn't had some trouble sitting back down on the bench, which of course drew his attention to her. To add insult to injury, Brocklehurst's daughters giggle during his speech, and he makes Jane wear a sign that reads "liar." He also orders that she stay on the stool until midnight, not just for half an hour, as in the book, and not just for the rest of the day, as in other adaptations. But Jane is rescued from despair later that night when Helen puts some food in her hand on the sly. This is followed by a scene where Jane and Helen talk over a book. Jane wants to escape Lowood, and Helen says she can if she works hard. She counsels diligent study, submission, and patience, advice that reminds me somewhat of Miss Temple's speech in 1996. Take advantage of this education to find your way out into the world. I don't think Helen said those things in the book, by the way. She was more concerned with telling Jane to turn the other cheek and going through life with her eyes focused on heaven, a message that's noticeably absent here. The small amount of dialogue here feels stilted to me, and I'm perpetually unsure about how old this Helen looks. In the shot of her at the assembly, she seems closer to 14, even older, but here she looks and sounds the same age as Jane, possibly even younger. It's like an optical illusion. Am I even looking at the same girl? Sickness comes, I assume it's typhus, and Jane wakes to find Helen's bed empty. She goes looking for her and finds her in some sort of chapel, laid out like an offering on an altar. It wasn't really pre-established that Helen had a cough, but since she's kept separate from everyone else, I guess we're to infer that she has a different ailment. I'm disappointed by the minimum of conversation between the two girls, and what there is doesn't have a lot in common with what's in the book. On the contrary, they further hammer in the dark religious symbolism in the scene with Jane's cry of "No, God can't have her." And then we get a creative transition. Jane sits by Helen's grave, venting her feelings through art, and then the page turns and we fast forward 8 years to Jane painting a flower and teaching an art class outside. And the section carries us a little further, with Jane receiving a letter, to the astonishment of her fellow teachers, which is the response to her advertisement. Last one, and remember, the 2011 version doesn't tell the story in the usual linear fashion. In a flashback, Jane arrives at another castle-like Lowood to a cold reception from Miss Scatcherd, who yanks her fine articles of clothing off of her. Jane's treated like a prisoner arriving at a jail, and perhaps Miss Scatcherd is even rougher and more bitter towards her because she so obviously comes from a wealthy home. At the other end of the room, girls are getting their hands checked for cleanliness. The whole picture is very dark and unnervingly shot, and this scene, more than any other for some reason, reminds me of Wackford Squeers' school in Nicholas Nickleby. We then go back for 2 scenes with the Rivers family. St. John questions Jane about her education, which triggers more memories of Lowood. Helen is punished for glancing behind her at Jane during their lessons. Miss Scatcherd, who looks like an evil Mother Goose, is about to strike her with the rod when Brocklehurst comes in. She starts to explain her actions, but he's like, "Oh no, that's great. I love to see the students get punished. Keep going." This seals the deal for me. I think he's the creepiest Brocklehurst we've seen yet. Jane, watching in horror, drops her slate, which brings everyone's attention to her. A lot of the dialogue here is slightly off, like Bronte's, but not really. We see a private conversation between Helen and Jane, where they establish that Helen is a preacher's daughter, and she refuses to hold a grudge against the one who punishes her. Jane talks about her aunt, and Helen assures Jane that she is loved, and that she's protected by a kingdom of spirits that surround them. Then there's another scene of adult Jane with the Rivers, before we jump right into Helen's death scene. This is another Helen who does a good job playing the slightly older sister role, and I really like her in this scene. She speaks of being happy about going home to God, something Jane struggles with, but Helen also wants Jane to stay with her, and the conflict of emotions, I think, is evident in her face. I have to mention that Helen shows up again in multiple deleted scenes, appearing as an apparition during Jane's emotional crisis. She's with her in the room as she's packing, she's lying beside her on the moor. She also seems to be leading Jane, encouraging her to go in the right direction. There are a lot of things like this in the 2011 version's deleted scenes that Jane Eyre fans feel would have improved the final product. These scenes would have worked well with the supernatural element already emphasized in this version, and Helen's reappearance would have been a unique twist, something we've never seen done before, showing how strong an influence Helen was on Jane, that even years later, she's with her in her most difficult moment. Okay, I'm done. I'm stating the obvious here, I hope, when I say that this part of the story is a difficult one. The conditions at Lowood, the punishments, the premature death of her best friend, these are all traumatic experiences that unquestionably have a physical, mental, emotional effect on Jane. When Rochester hears she was a Lowood student and says, "You must be tenacious of life," a knee-jerk response would be to say, "You ain't kiddin'." Is there a particular version of the Lowood section that I like the best? Well, no. It's kind of a section that I look forward to being over. I do enjoy aspects of it to a certain extent, but I don't really relish it. Is it anybody's favorite part of Jane Eyre? I don't think so. It's all miserable. Once again, I do have a preference for the 1983 interpretation, even without Helen's deathbed scene, so I guess that means that 1983 has my favorite depiction of Jane's childhood overall. But I do think certain versions, like 1970, 1996, 2011, bring something extra to the table here, especially when it comes to Helen, who is a tricky character to get right. You don't want her to be bland or forgettable, but you don't want her to be too sweet or too good either, and I don't want her character, as Bronte intended it to be, watered down and made virtually unrecognizable. Alright everybody, that concludes this flashback portion of the Jane Eyre adaptation comparison series. I am glad to have this video behind me because I have been dreading it. I knew all along that it was going to be an overwhelming amount of content, and I still have to edit this video, which is not going to be fun. If you have stuck around through this entire video, thank you, I really appreciate that, and feel free to share your thoughts on the Lowood section of the adaptations in the comments below. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching!